My start in Hot Springs was from 1945. I was 8 years old.
Lived at 110 Kenwood, and Larry lived, it's a 2-block long street, and Larry lived at the end of it for a short time. Then his parents wisely moved him out on Malvern Highway, which is way out in the woods, we thought.
About the age of 10, I started making a little bit of money myself. After school, during the racing season, among other things, in the yard work and other stuff, I would sell pink sheets, as they were called, for the Hot Springs Sentinel Record New Era. Now, what are pink sheets? During the racing season, communications wasn't as it is now. So the pink sheets were the publication of racing information for the visitors and the tourists and the gamblers who came to Hot Springs. One day, there was a family friend who was one of the GI boys who returned from Hot Springs. His name was Q. Byram Hurst. He stopped me one day on the sidewalk and says, "Come here, Larry, I want you to meet somebody," and took me in what was the Southern Grill. It was the little restaurant at the base right of the Southern Hotel. And so he took me back, and there was a scrawny little man that was there. He says, "I want you to meet this gentleman." Fine. And he says, "I want you to meet Mr. Oney Madden." At that time, didn't mean a lot to me. And Mr. Madden was very nice. He asked how many I had left the very first time I met him of the pink sheets. And I counted them, and I think I had something like 21. He said, gave me a $5 bill for the rest of the pink sheets. I was rich. That was a lot of money in 1947, 48, or somewhere in that range. That started a friendship between Mr. Madden and myself as I grew in Hot Springs. Mr. Madden, before he died, was very nice to me, remembered me, and Mrs. Madden also. But that one occasion that when I met Oney Madden, and then later understood that he was a rather notorious national gambler out of New York. And later found out that he was skinny because he had survived quite a few gun battles. He had 12 bullet wounds in his body.
So Larry kind of disappeared from my life, and the Kenwood gang, which we had 35 or 40 people sometimes, which include Hobson, Garland, Kenwood, Prospect, Quapaw, a lot of places. Larry came back into my life. He's 4 years older when I got out of the service, and I think he might have been living in New Orleans at that time.
As a 10, 12, 13-year-old boy and only child, I went with my parents everywhere. So when they would go out to eat, Club Belvedere on a weekend was a good place that we would go because Mom liked to dance. They always had a band on weekends. And while Mom and Dad were dancing, I was adopted by some of the staff at Belvedere, starting with Esther Nunnally. She managed the bar. And it was a little boring for me to be around, and so I would hike up on a bar stool. Esther would take care of me with all the Coke that I wanted. And I met people, talked with people, and just had fun. And then I would wander into the casino where all of the adults were. That casino, all of the men had coats and ties. All of the ladies tried to dress really, really nice. And so it was that kind of atmosphere that I would just walk into as a young kid, preteen. And there was a bouncer, we'll call him, crowd control man or whatever, that was always at the entrance. Became my personal friend and a family friend for years after, until he died. His name was Harry Foley, a big, kind of square-shouldered gentleman. Put his arm around me. With one hand, he could pick me up so easily. But he just took care of me. That was a time period in my life. Never again will I ever experience things like that. Even going to Las Vegas or wherever, it will never be like it was at that time. I do remember one time with Harry Foley, very rarely did I ever see in any, the Southern Club or the Belvedere Club, anybody getting out of line. It occasionally happened, obviously, but there was one time I do remember that there was a loud gentleman out in the foyer, and I had to come out of the casino, and it got my attention. And there was Mr. Foley trying to control him very nicely, hold him down, and this guy got belligerent. Well, what I didn't say is Harry Foley was an ex-professional boxer. He tried to get this gentleman down, and the man took one swing at him, he blocked him, and he came around with one of those ham hooks and got him right at the base of the neck and squeezed, and the man dropped to the floor. I found out later that Harry knew exactly where there's certain nerves that control consciousness in the brain, and he knew how to manipulate them with those big hands.
We didn't really gamble a lot. We were just in our 20s. Almost every restaurant and bar had 3 or 4 slot machines as you entered. And this usually paid for their rent and overhead for the month. Of course, the big gambling places was the Vapors and the Southern. There were a few others, the Ohio Club.
Community, as a community, started before the formation of the states by our Native Americans, our Indians, and prior to them, a gentleman that's a good Spanish explorer by the name of Hernando de Soto, who visited Hot Springs as he explored this continent of the North America continent, and because of the springs. So, as the name indicates, our history has always evolved around those hot springs. They attracted the Native Americans not only for the springs and the healing water, and tribes, even though that they were warring tribes or enemies of each other, when they came to Hot Springs, there was no, they left that behind. And from there, those early Americans, the Hot Springs then attracted in mid-1800s, 19th century, and early 20th century settlers, pioneers, who came to the springs because, again, of the hot springs. And in those days, with very little law and so forth, you can only imagine, and I can only imagine, what that environment was like. And from my memory now, which I may miss it a year or two, but I believe it was 1862 that the United States government set aside a section of land around this whole Hot Springs area and set it aside as the, quote, Hot Springs Reservation. That was the first formality of creating an environment that could grow with some control.
It was a wonderful place, a good place to be brought up in. Wouldn't give anything for my childhood because we were active. This was before cell phones, TV, and all this other stuff that monopolizes teenagers now.
I think that at that time, my family was just indicative of so many across this country that did the same thing. And that's how this country has grown. That's how Hot Springs has grown, by the peers of my family doing similar things, and not only growing for their family, but growing their city. And so with all of that as a basis from 1945, this city area has been blessed not only with its natural resources, but with its human resources.